The American Congressional Exchange is a program that we have that BPC started where we bring two members together, a Republican and a Democrat from two very different parts of the country, and we have them visit each individual's districts and really get to know not only that member, but also that district.
Now, up until that trip, I did not know David Trone. And because of his willingness to make the trip, to come out, to spend that time with me, I can testify that I now have a friend and an ally on many issues of mutual concern.
Many of us share the same principles, and we bring to the table different life experiences, different political perspectives. We shouldn't find that dangerous or divisive. We should find it something to celebrate.
This is how America works, is by coming together, rolling up our sleeves, getting away from the partisanship, getting away from the rhetoric, and getting back to just delivering.
When you have a conversation with people and you laugh and you get to know them, you no longer see them in the same light, and you're much more willing to say, let's figure out how we can be friends and really find solutions. It creates a different type of dialogue and friendship that exists, and it also allows those members to see how different parts of the country are and how many similarities there are.
Well, I want to welcome everyone back to the Bipartisan Policy Center. We're here in Washington, D.C. My name is Linda Smith. For those of you who know me, I'm the director of the Early Childhood Initiative here at BPC. If you don't know what BPC is, we are a Washington, D.C. based think tank that tries to look at both sides of the aisle for policies that we can put together to promote solutions to America's most pressing problems. And obviously in this country, childcare, early childhood is a pressing problem. And within that, we also know that we have had a lot of challenges in this country on the issue of racial bias, equity, etc. So today's topic is racial bias in early childhood education settings and its impact. And I think it goes without saying that we have the nation's leading expert on this issue, Dr. Walter Gilliam, with us today, and he's going to present his findings on this, and then we will take questions from the audience at the end. For those of you who don't know Dr. Gilliam, he is a leading expert in education, health, and mental health of young children. He was recently named as the new executive director of the Buffett Early Institute at Nebraska University. Prior to that, he was a professor of child psychiatry and psychology at Yale University and director of the Yale's Ed Ziegler Center on Child Development and Social Policy. I think I could go on and on about his qualifications, but I think they're going to become very apparent as he presents his data to us. He has looked at childcare and in the impact of some of what he's been looking at, both with the equity issue with children, but also the impact on the early childhood workforce, which I think is pretty important given what's going on in this country. So without much further ado in terms of his background, I'm going to turn it over to him and let him do his presentation, and then we'll take questions and have a conversation about what we see. So Walter, do you want to go ahead?
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's such an honor to be here with you, to be with the Bipartisan Policy Center and all the wonderful work that happens here and with this terrific audience of folk. So as you had said, I've been beating this drum a long time. I first started talking about the topic of children being expelled from preschool programs back in 2000, well, probably about 2002 or 3, and then the big findings came out in 2005. And then working with the Congressional Black Caucus and other folks on what the disproportionality in that really means and what we should be doing about that. It's one of those topics that makes it impossible to not be able to look at the fact that it's a horrible, terrible thing, expelling children from early care and education programs, but it's also not something that happens equally across the boards, that some children are at much greater risk of losing their placements than others are. And it's an inescapable fact, and so a lot of the work that I've been doing has been taking in that direction. You were very kind, Linda, when you said that that I'm a leading voice in the topic. But the reality is now there's a lot of wonderful leading voices. There's Chantel Meek, who's doing terrific work on this, Ioma Aruka, who's doing terrific work on this, Tunette Powell, Rosemary Allen, on and on. I could go on and on. Who are also doing and Kate Zinzer, who just literally wrote a book about the topic. So there's a lot of people who are really doing some terrific things on this, and it's wonderful to see that. So when I think about the topic of children being expelled from preschool programs, I'm reminded of the canary in the coal mine. In that, the metaphor of the canary in the coal mine, and the coal miner went down, and the coal miner brought a canary into the coal mine, and then if there was something wrong with the environment, something wrong with the quality of the air, the canary would get sick, and then they would know that this is not safe for anybody, and they would come back up. The smart coal miner would bring the canary in the coal mine and watch the canary and pay attention. The smart coal miner would not, if the canary got sick, go get a new canary, create a canary rehabilitation program, try to figure out ways to be able to provide better reparative care to canaries. The smart coal miner would realize there's something wrong in the environment that's causing that to happen. And so I would challenge you when I talk, especially about a topic like children being expelled from preschool programs and stuff like that, remember that for every child who loses their placement, there's probably at least 10 other children that somebody kind of wished they could kick out. And this is about those children too. It's about all of these children. So when I think about like early expulsions and suspensions, and these go by a lot of different names, and some people even talk about soft suspensions, like telling a child to go home early, and then the next day go home early again, and then the next day go home early again, and then eventually this is no longer viable childcare. And so what happens as a result? Well, the child's parents have to take them out of the program and go find other arrangements because the parents in many cases have to work, and so it goes by a lot of names. We oftentimes refer to it as exclusions simply because that can count like a permanent kicking out or temporary, or these kind of ways in which it can be made clear to a family that your child's no longer welcome in the program, so that the parent can voluntarily remove their child, except that it's not really voluntary. They're just removing them because they need the childcare, but they don't need just childcare, they need reliable childcare, And so when I think about it from that perspective, I think about the research that shows us all the harms that can happen immediately from that. And you can see some of those in this list here, and all the harms that can happen later on down the road. And I'll get to some of these later as we're talking about this more. But here's the rate of expulsions in K through 12. There it is in pre-K, and here it is in childcare. And you can see that in childcare, the rate of expulsions is about 13 times that of grades K through 12 combined. In pre-K programs, mostly administered through state departments of education, local education agencies, is about 3 times that of grades K through 12 combined. That's what we knew back in 2005. So this is nothing new. We've known this for a really long time, that children are more likely to get expelled in preschool programs than K through 12. But if you really want to find the expulsions, go out into the programs that have even fewer resources and supports. That's where the greatest level of expulsions are typically happening. If you were to take every single child that's expelled from a preschool program across the country, you could fill up the Simmons Bank Liberty Stadium in Memphis, Tennessee 3 times over, and you still have 16,500 expelled preschoolers standing in the parking lot with no place to sit. That's how many children we expel every single year from our early care and education programs. So who is it that's most likely to get expelled? Well, this is going back to some of the stuff that we were first finding back in 2005. We found that when you had mixed age groups, where you have 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds together, 4-year-old children were a little more likely to be expelled, about 50% more likely than 3-year-old children. We didn't have any hypothesis going into the studies as to whether or not younger children or older children And so rather than doing what scientists oftentimes do, which is get a surprising finding and then sit around and hypothesize with your friends as to what you think it means, we decided to do something different, and we got together a group of preschool teachers and we said, this is what people like you in a survey said. What do you think it means? Can you help us understand from your perspective why somebody who does your job for a living would say something like this? And the result that we got back from these focus groups were that preschool teachers would say things like, well, it's one thing if you have a child who's aggressive and the child's this big, and it's just different if the child's this big. And so we were a little confused by that, like exactly how does height factor into your expulsion decisions? And so the teachers said the next thing. They said, well, if a child is smaller, then the child's probably smaller than every other child in the classroom. We're about the same size anyway. But if the child's bigger, then maybe the child might be bigger than some other children, and then maybe somebody will get hurt. Which was our first clue that it's not just about the behavior of the child. It's about what we adults imagine might happen as a result of that behavior. If I have a smaller child who's aggressive, that doesn't feel as scary to me as if I have a child that I perceive as being bigger. If I see a child who I perceive as being bigger, then it's a little scarier because maybe that child will hurt somebody. In other words, children are not being expelled for their behaviors. They're being expelled because of our worries about those behaviors. And that's all the room that bias needs. That's all it needs, just that little bit, where it's no longer really about the behavior of the child, it's about our perception of something like that. So the next thing that we had found was that Black preschoolers were being expelled at about twice the rate of white preschoolers, and that boys were more than 4 times as likely as girls to be expelled from preschool programs. So when you put it all together, there's really 3 B's of expulsion risk from preschool. You have big, black, and boy. And the more of those that exist within an individual child, the greater the likelihood that that child will be expelled from a preschool program. I'm not saying the greater the likelihood that that child will have challenging behaviors. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying the greater the likelihood that that child's challenging behaviors might be met with an expulsion, a removal from the program. But make no mistake about it, even though bigger children or black children or boys are more likely to be expelled, the greatest overall risk factor for being expelled from school is being a preschooler, being a young child. The younger you are, when it comes to before K through 12, the greater the likelihood that you're going to be expelled. And there are some data that were collected in Chicago with Linda Gilkerson and company, I think through the Erickson Institute, looking specifically at infant toddler child care. And it happens there too. So when you think about these kind of things, it's certainly a head scratcher as to why we would allow something like that to exist. And when we first found these findings back in 2005, when we publicized it and started working with members of the Congressional Black Caucus and some other individuals, I started working with a congressman named Mr. Danny Davis of Chicago, who was a member of the House Education Committee and the Congressional Black Caucus, and he took a strong interest in this, as did his Deputy Chief of Staff, Jill Hunter Williams, who used to be a Head Start mental health consultant herself before she became a staffer working with Mr. Davis. And so they were interested in the topic, and Mr. Davis was instrumental in convincing the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights to start collecting data specifically on the topic of children being expelled from preschool programs. And you can see from this slide here that what they ultimately found about a decade after we had found it was pretty much the same thing that we found, the same kind of disparities along the same kind of lines. There's a lot of things that one can compare preschool expulsion to. And some people have talked about the preschool to prison pipeline. And so I'm going to say a few words about that. If you were to look at like the expulsion rate in the United States back, based on the 2005 report that we had, but also on a study that was conducted in 2016 using the National Children's Health Survey, you can see that in terms of full-on expulsions, about 6 expulsions per 1,000 children enrolled, based on teacher report in our national study that we released back in 2005. And it's a little bit higher, about 7.5 per 1,000 if you ask parents. So what is the adult incarceration rate in 2019? Well, the adult incarceration rate at 2019 is kind of about the same, pretty much in the same kind of neighborhood. And what if we were to look at gender disparities and race disparities? Here is the increased likelihood of boys being expelled from preschool compared to girls. About 4.5 times as likely boys are to be as expelled. Depending on whether the surveys were being completed by whether you ask teachers or school administrators or parents. So what is the increased likelihood of men being incarcerated versus women in the United States? Well, a little bit higher, but kind of in the neighborhood. What about race? This is what we have here from those kind of studies, looking at teacher report, school report, parent report, in terms of the increased likelihood of Black children being expelled from preschool programs compared to white children. So, about 3.5 times as likely. Well, what is it like for adult incarceration? How much more likely are Black individuals as opposed to white individuals? Well, kind of about the same. And so when you think about it, I suppose this doesn't necessarily prove that there's a preschool to prison pipeline. But if there is, isn't it amazing how consistent the diameter of the pipe is? From preschool all the way to adult incarceration, those who we decide at greater rates to kick out of the society of early care and education become the exact same individuals later that we decide to kick out of the greater society in terms of incarceration. Exact same individuals. So when I think about it from this perspective, I suppose it doesn't necessarily prove that one is leading to the other. But wow, what a coincidence if it isn't. And so something to think about. When we think about some of the research on preschool expulsion and suspension, we know that when children are expelled or suspended early on in their elementary school career, it tends to lead to increased negative attitudes about school, increased likelihood that they're going to fail a grade, fail a subject, be retained. Expulsion early on is one of the greatest predictors of expulsion later on, which is interesting in and of itself, because if the idea of expulsion is it's supposed to be some kind of a message, or it's supposed to be some kind of an intervention, well, it's obviously a pretty terrible one because it doesn't work. The children we decide to expel in early years become the exact same children individually that we're expelling later on. And early expulsion and suspensions predict high school dropout rate about tenfold. Increases your rate of being dropping out of high school about tenfold, increases the rate of adult incarceration about eightfold. And here's a new study that came out not too long ago, in 2019, looking at data from the National Survey of Children's Health. Children of incarcerated parents are at 3 times greater risk of being expelled from preschool. So in other words, if there's a parent who's incarcerated and they have a preschooler at home, that preschooler is at a 3 times increased likelihood of being expelled. So if I put all of that together, I basically end up with this. We end up with a baby who might be at increased risk of being expelled from a preschool program. And if they do, that places that child at greater risk of dropping out of school. And then that increases the likelihood that they're going to be incarcerated. And then when they have a child themselves, that child is at greater risk of being incarcerated. And the cycle repeats itself over and over again. So maybe it's really not a preschool to prison pipeline, but more like a preschool to prison corkscrew that keeps going around and around, generation after generation, until we decide to stop it at some point. And the place that I would predict would be the best place to stop it would be right there, and hopefully be able to save us and the greater society and a lot of children and families an awful lot of agony. So there was, going back to the study involving the National Survey of Children's Health, they were looking at ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and I'm sure that many of you here know about these. These are all these terrible things that can happen, or challenging things that can happen to you when you're young that can impact your health and mental health later on. And they were looking at a series of these, and when they correlated that with being expelled or suspended from an early care and education program, literally every single adverse childhood experience was related to an increased likelihood of expulsion and suspension. When you think about sort of like what many of these represent, like domestic violence, family mental illness, adult substance abuse, parental incarceration, maybe even parental divorce, so many of these are variables about how it becomes more difficult for a young child to have a stable relationship with a caregiver at home. And so, what is the net result when that happens? When they have a disruption or there's challenges that make it hard for them to have a stable relationship to an adult caring for them at home, then we typically respond by removing their other adult caring relationship by kicking them out of the preschool program or the child care program. They get to lose both of those relationships, the one at home as well as the one in the program that they might be outside of their home. One of the things that we'd also found very early on, and we've replicated this, and other people have replicated this too, is that teacher stress was a strong predictor of expulsion rates. The more stress that a teacher reported in her daily life and the more stress that they reported regarding around the nature of their work, the greater the likelihood is that that teacher will expel a child from their program that year. And what we also found too back in 2005 was that when teachers screened positive for depression, their own depression, that they were expelling children at literally twice the rate of teachers who screened negative for depression. When you think about it, it kind of makes sense, I suppose. Like when children are living with stress and lots of difficult, challenging things, they put all of the stress of their lives and their homes and their communities in a backpack, and they take it to school with them in a child care program or a preschool program, and they dump it out on the table for the early care and education provider to deal with. And so do the adults. We carry our stress with us too. And so one of the things that we found that was a strong predictor of the likelihood of a child being kicked out of a preschool program is a teacher who's so stressed that they just don't have another nerve left. And in many cases, what they do is they resort to expelling one of their stressors from the program. The problem with that, of course, is that when you expel this stressor, which child becomes the next one for you? And it's not a solution, it's just a way to get through one day to the next. A lot of this stuff was aggravated, though, fairly recently with COVID-19. My team at Yale, when we were at the beginning of this pandemic, we were interested in things like COVID-19 transmission and the rate of transmission and whether or not childcare was even safe for children to be in and childcare providers to be in. And so we started doing epidemiologic studies of early care and education providers across the nation. We had, about 85,000 early care and education providers participating in the first wave. Now we have over 126,000 of these amazing early childhood professionals who are participating in these epidemiologic studies all from across the nation. And some of the things that we'd found, and this was, you can see that this is as of a while ago. So back in August of 2021, 21% of the workforce had tested positive for COVID-19. 3% of them had been hospitalized. This is people who are actually in the early care and education workforce. And about half of those had spent some time in the ICU or intubated. About 2% of them had had a household member hospitalized. Just under 1% had had a household member die of COVID-19 during the first year and a half of the COVID-19 pandemic. And when you think about the amount of economic stressors too, like 3 months into the pandemic, 35% of our early care and education workforce was without a job. And of those who did have a job, many of their programs had at least temporarily closed. Some of them eventually closed forever. And that was what the nature of their life was like. They didn't really know, if their program would be closed, if it did close, if it was going to open. If they closed temporarily, does that mean I don't get paid? Many of them, they're not salaried workers. In many cases, they're hourly workers. And when the amount of hours the program is open changes, that means that their actual income changes. These are not salaried workers like most K through 12 teachers are. And so this is a huge, huge impact on this workforce. When we were first collecting these data, we wanted to know more about the health and the mental health of the workforce. And you can see, some of the information we have there about chronic health conditions that might have made them increased risk of COVID's severe outcomes. One of the things that we noticed is that the rate of asthma, moderate to severe asthma, that were being reported by early care and education providers was about 20% higher than what you would expect for the general female population in the United States. That's what we were finding at the beginning of the pandemic. And it raises a lot of really interesting, important questions. And I think the big one was, well, why? Why would childcare providers be at an increased risk of asthma? And so one of the things that my team is doing now at Yale, with some incredible, fabulous, wonderful colleagues, including people in pediatric infectious disease and epidemiology, and this wonderful, amazing colleague who is a chemical engineer who has a patent on passive air monitors, is we're doing a study in Richmond, Virginia soon, where we are going to be fitting early care and education providers with air quality monitors that they wear at home and in the program, and working with colleagues at VCU that are measuring outdoor air quality within their neighborhood and the neighborhood in which they work, in order to be able to figure out, is it possible that air quality is contributing to this, and does that mean that it's because of the poor facilities that many of these early care and education programs are in which case it's the air that the adults are breathing as well as the children, or is it because of the challenging housing conditions that many of our early care and education providers have to live in because we pay them so terribly, or is it both? And so we're wanting to be able to chase down some of these things, because if you care deeply about a profession, if you care deeply about children, you can't not care about those who care for those children. That means caring about them as individuals. It means caring about their health. It means caring about their welfare. It means caring about their financial stability as well. Here's one of the more depressing slides that I'm going to show. There was this study that was done looking at different professions in the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic and what their death rates were from COVID-19 complications, And there was this reporter from Chalkbeat who contacted the authors and said, would you mind breaking it out by not only teachers, but also childcare workers? They're curious what it would look like for early educators. And when you look at that, you can see that during the first year of COVID-19 pandemic, well, I guess really more like 9 months, because the pandemic was declared in March, 405 childcare providers had death certificates that listed COVID-19 as the reason of death. And when you divide it by the number of people that were listed in the American Community Survey working in that particular profession, childcare provider death rates due to COVID-19 were 38 deaths per 100,000, significantly higher than other essential workers who were at 30, significantly higher still than all workers put together, and certainly way higher than non-essential workers who were at 16, and that's where K through 12 teachers were, 16 per. And so when you think about it from that perspective too, it's not just that the health conditions are something to be worried about, but this has huge implications even on mortality, that the likelihood of them dying from COVID-19 complications was significantly higher than just about any other profession that you could possibly look at. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had these early care and education providers complete for us the Center for Epidemiologic Studies Depression Scale. It's a measure that's used to estimate depression rates in a large population. 46% of our workforce was screening positive for diagnosable levels of depression within 2 to 3 months of the beginning of the pandemic. And then when we came back to them in August of 2021, that 46% became 56%. 56%, more than half of the workforce with potentially diagnosable levels of major depression. And you can see what the moderate to severe stress rates are. We are going back into the field later this month, and we will be collecting some more follow-up data. And so we hope to be able to have some more data on that to be able to report. These are unsustainable levels. That level of depression is way too high for any profession, nonetheless a profession charged with caring for very young, vulnerable children. That is a terrible thing for them as humans. That is a terrible thing for all of us as a society. It is literally just intolerable that the vast majority of our early care and education providers charged with caring for our youngest children could be clinically diagnosably depressed. When I look at depression rates based on educator self-reported race, this is how it breaks out. And if I looked at it based on severe stress rates, based on self-reported early educator race, this is how it breaks out there. But depression and stress were also related to some other things, including work security and pay security. We looked at sort of work security and pay security this way. Child care providers, early educators who never lost a day of work, their program stayed open, and they never lost a day of pay, versus those who their program temporarily closed maybe and reopened, and maybe closed and reopened several times, but they still got paid through all of that, versus those whose programs temporarily opened and reopened and they lost pay because of that, versus those who completely lost their job. And if you look at it from that kind of a trajectory in terms of increasing instability of the work condition as well as the pay condition, it mirrored increasing depression rates and stress rates. And it certainly makes sense. How many of us wouldn't be stressed out if we thought we were going to lose our job? Stressed out if we thought we were going to lose our pay? How many of us wouldn't be stressed out more than we think we would be if we were making as little money as they are? The stress level even higher, I would imagine. So that's what we found there. But we also found this, that there was a strong relationship between child care provider, early educator, stress and depression, and their exposure to racialized aggression during the course of the pandemic. Let me tell you a little bit more about that. We asked early care and education providers across the nation whether or not they had been exposed to racialized aggression, either verbal aggression or physical aggression that had a racialized component to it, either because racialized terms were being used, because of the context of what was happening. And we asked them about it in 3 different ways. Have you been the direct target of racialized aggression, verbal or physical, during the course of the pandemic? Has somebody you loved been the direct target of racialized aggression during the course of the pandemic? And have you ever witnessed firsthand racialized aggression against somebody else? That's what we were asking them. And what you can see here is overall, about 29% of our early care and education workforce reported that they had experienced racialized aggression in some way, either directly or indirectly. And then you can see how that differs based on the self-reported race of the early educator. Now, we haven't yet broken out Latina and Hispanic and other types of ethnic groups, but we're working to break them out. It's a little bit more complicated because race and ethnicity can overlap, and so you have to be really thoughtful about how you trace some of those things out. But you can see how that breaks down. And you can see also if they were the direct target, about 8% said I was the direct target, and you can see the very high rate there for African American, but not too far behind Asian Americans too, who at the very beginning of the pandemic were experiencing an awful lot of anti-Asian hate that was being perpetrated towards them in ways that was unlike, certainly anti-Asian hate is nothing new, but the level of that was coming at them at the beginning of the pandemic was quite incredible. And then witnessing. And you can also see too, the rates that were being reported by early care and education providers who are multiracial, much higher than a lot of other groups. And in many ways, it kind of makes sense because they were experiencing racial tension from perhaps multiple different angles, and they were stuck right in the middle of it. Somebody very close to them, you can see how that breaks down. And one of the things that we had found was this, that race didn't predict change in mental health status over the course of the pandemic. So the race of the individual early care and education provider didn't predict decreased mental health functioning or increased mental health problems unless we entered into the statistical model exposure to racialized aggression. And once we did that, then race became a significant predictor, especially for African American and Asian American early care and education providers. In other words, it wasn't race that was driving decreased mental health functioning or increased mental health problems. It was the racism that they were experiencing. That was what was really driving it. And the findings were fairly clear, and it's causing us to now embark on a lot of other studies. We have a study going on right now specifically on anti-Asian hate that was experienced by Asian American early care and education providers, and what the nature of that was and how that impacted not only their daily life, but the amount of care that they were able to provide and the quality of that care that they were able to provide when the children in their care looked like them, or when the children in their care might have looked like those perpetrating the hate. Because all of these things have a way of getting into early care and education programs. And once they get into early care and education programs, then they can become their own contaminant inside the program. And remember when we were first talking about COVID-19 and all the ways to be able to try to keep child care programs safe. And much of it is about trying to find a way to be able to keep COVID-19 from getting into the early care and education program. But eventually, all of the ills of society will find a way of getting into our early care and education programs. And once they get into there, then they can wreak additional havoc unless we have a way to address it. And when we have a workforce that is almost exclusively women, it's what, 96%, 97% women? And we know that women are oftentimes the targets of community violence. And we have a workforce that's disproportionately, especially in many sectors, women of color. And we know that our individuals of color are the more likely to experience racialized trauma. When we have a workforce like the workforce that we have, it shouldn't be a surprise to us that they're going to have the stressors that you would expect that demographic to have. And for us to not be ready for that and to respond to that is an indication of how little regard we have for them. The measure of how much a society truly loves its children is how well we care for those who care for those children. And by that measure, we're not doing a very good job, not only in terms of the way in which we pay and compensate these early care and education providers, but also in terms of how we take care of their health and mental health and general well-being. We cannot be our very best for the children we want to care for unless we're doing the very best that we can for those individuals who are dedicating their lives to caring for other people's children. So when I think about the impact of COVID-19 on young children in other ways too, I mean, here's some of the data on the impact that it had as of June 2021. And again, we're collecting some more data right now in terms of increased likelihood of children having people in their family who have been hospitalized with COVID-19 or people in their family who had died of COVID-19. 12% of our early care and education providers reporting that at least one child in their program had a family member who had died of COVID-19 just within about the first 1 year of the COVID-19 pandemic. And 7% reporting that 5 or more of the children in their program have had a family member who have died. I know that some of the times when people go into a profession, you find out that there's elements of your job that you did not think you were signing up for. And I would imagine that an awful lot of our early care and education providers did not know that they were also signing up to be a grief counselor. But many of them became that. And I wonder about how much support that they had with that, especially as they were dealing with their own stressors and their own grief. And what challenge this must have been for them to be able to absorb all of the challenges that they had in their daily life and then go into a program and try to take care of all the challenges of all those families and communities that they're serving that are also being ported into that program on the backs of backpacks on children. That's an incredible thing for me to think about how much these early care and education providers were shouldering. It does not surprise me that we lost an awful lot of early care and education providers in the course of the pandemic and that we're having a hard time filling the role right now. In part, it's about how terrible we treat them and pay them and everything else, but in part, it's also about this. It is really, really hard. It is hard to care for another person. It is hard to love another. Every time you do, you carry the stress of that other. We hire people that we hope love our babies, and that's why they're early care and education providers. And when they love those babies, I tell you now, it will come with a toll. It will come with a weight. If we hire people who love our babies, they will carry the weight of that. We need to be there in order to be able to help them shoulder that weight. That if they are the hands that rock the cradles, then we need to be the hands that steady those hands that rock the cradle by having better policies to be able to make sure that they are well cared for so that they can take care of the children in their care. Children with greater mental health needs. We asked the teachers in these programs whether or not the children in their care were more externalizing, acting out, aggressive behaviors, hyperactive behaviors. We asked whether they were more internalizing, more shy, withdrawal, clingy. We even asked whether or not they had other ways in which they might be showing stress inside their bodies, like eating problems, sleeping problems, increased wetting, soiling, things like that, regression of developmental milestones that they might have had before. These other kind of somaticizing kind of ways that stress can show up in terms of body functioning. And in August of 2021, 64%, about 2/3 of them, said that the children in their care were more externalizing than what they would have expected before the pandemic. 22% said that's true of half or more of the children in their care. And then you can see how that breaks down based on also internalizing, acting shy and withdrawn and clingy, crying a lot, somaticizing. That's a statement about these children, and it's also a statement about what these caregivers are having to manage. That much distress in the children in their care. And so we had known this before the pandemic, that family and child stress, especially when it comes into contact with stressed out teachers, that's the recipe for expulsions. And right now, this is the recipe that we have. We have child and family stress at all-time highs with incredibly stressed out teachers. And so I would certainly expect a whole lot more expulsions, especially as enrollment rates start to stabilize. So as enrollment rates start to stabilize, I would expect certainly that there's going to be a lot more stressed out children coming into contact with teachers who are literally on their last nerve. And that's the recipe by which children get kicked out of preschool programs. I just recently saw this on a professional listserv of childcare providers, literally saying, what do I need to do to expel a child from my program? What's the legal process? And if you take all of that and then you add racial bias, that really adds a completely different lens on it. Biases are about the assumptions and the expectations that we have. And these assumptions that we have about others are based on the representations that we might have in our mind. I'm oftentimes asked to explain to folks, what a bias is or what bias might be like. And I've tried to think of different ways. And one way that I've come across is this riddle that perhaps you might have heard before. In the riddle, imagine there's these two men, a father and a son, and they're driving their car down the road. You might have heard this riddle before. They're driving their car down the road, and unfortunately, there's a terrible accident, and the father dies at the scene, and the son is taken to the hospital, and then they call the top surgeon in the hospital to come and do life-saving surgery on the son. And the nurses all scrub in and get the patient ready on the table, and they call in the top surgeon. The top surgeon comes there and scrubs in and gets all ready and comes in there and looks down at the patient and looks up at the nurses and says, I can't do this surgery, that's my son. And when you tell that riddle to some people, maybe most people, they think, well, how's that possible? How can that be the top surgeon's son if the father died in the automobile accident? And I've heard some people say, well, maybe, he's adopted and he's got two dads or a stepdad. Maybe he's got two gay dads. I mean, all these things are possible. I heard somebody, once said, well, maybe he's Catholic and the man in the car was his priest. I suppose all these things are possible. But perhaps the most likely is that the top surgeon in the hospital is his mother, a woman. But it's amazing how when you hear something like that, our biases will cause us to create a mental image, a mental representation of what we expect. And then it makes us, some of the times the bias will make us see things that aren't there. And some of the times our biases will make us not see things that are. And that's how biases oftentimes work. They're all based on representations that are in our mind. And those representations can come from a whole host of different things. If the predominant image that we had in America was a top surgeon looked like this image right there, then I'd have to tell you this riddle in a completely different way. I'd have to say, there was these two women in a car, a mother and a daughter. That's how I would have to tell the riddle if the image in America of a top surgeon was a woman. And with that in mind, think about this. What is the image that comes to mind of a child who has challenging behaviors? Or a child who acts up? Or a child who is the one who needs extra help every day? Or what's the image that pops into your mind of the child who's the teacher's little helper? What's the image in your mind of the child who is the class leader, the creative one? All of these are images that can kind of pop into our mind and can impact the way in which we view the children that we care about, or view any human that we care about. We did a study back in 2015 looking at implicit bias in preschool classrooms based on some of the things that I just mentioned to you. It was largely funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And in this study, we had early care and education providers from around the nation, 132 of them, and they looked at a screen. And on the screen, there were children in a classroom, and they wore headphones, and there was an eye tracking device attached to the screen. And in the headphones, it said, please watch this little thing, and the little ball bounced around, and it calibrated the eye tracker to their eyes, and the eye tracker could measure down to a pixel and down to about 1,000th of a second exactly where they were looking on the screen. And then it said, next, we're going to show you a video for about 6 minutes, shot from different angles, and we want you to look for signs and symptoms of an emerging challenging behavior. The secret, we said, to being able to manage challenging behaviors in a classroom is to be able to see a behavior problem before it becomes too problematic to really be able to manage. Watch this video, and anytime you see a child do something that could lead to a challenging behavior, we want you to hit this button, and we give them a button to hit. That was the instructions. So those were the things that we told them. The things that we didn't tell them were this. None of the children are going to misbehave. And the reason that we know this is because essentially all the children in the video are child actors that we've placed at a table. A black boy, black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And so I'm really not interested in how quickly you can find behavior problems. What I'm interested in is this. When I lead you to expect a child's going to misbehave, where do your biases take your eyes? When I say misbehave, what's the image of a child that pops into your head? And which child here matches that image? That's what we were ultimately testing for. And so to give you a sense of what it looked like, here's just a few seconds of the clip. So you see the children there. We shot the clip from different angles so that we could rotate the placement of the children, because we typically have in Western cultures a bias that we look from left to right and from foreground to background. Did you hear all the background noise too? All the excited things that were happening? They were actually the only 4 children in the room. There were cameramen and other people in the room too. One of my research assistants went to Amazon and purchased something called typical preschool noises from Amazon. And then we layered it into it so that we could make it a little more authentic. So I suppose one of the things you can take home from this is that if you don't have enough typical preschool noises in your day, you can go purchase them. Yeah. To give you a sense of what it actually looked like, we recreated the study in a local early care and education program. There's a preschool teacher. You see the little black bar at the bottom? That's the eye tracker. There she is looking at it. Here's Maria. She's a research assistant. She sees the exact same thing that the preschool teacher's looking at, except in her video, there's a yellow dot. That yellow dot is where the teacher's looking right at that moment. And because we're able to record this and collect that, that allowed us to then be able to go back frame by frame and identify where different children were and calculate the amount of time that was being spent looking at one child versus another child when a teacher was expecting a child to misbehave. And then at the end of it, the screen goes blank, and then we say, please remember the letter of the child you believe required the most of your attention. We don't tell the teachers this, but we're still tracking their eyes. And we know what letter they look at. We know which letter they seem to be trying to memorize. And the screen goes blank one more time. And then we say, please enter the letter of the child that you felt you had to watch the most. Because what we were interested in was this. When I lead you to believe that a child's going to misbehave, where do your biases take your eyes? Who do you think is going to be misbehaving? And then at this point, and are you aware of it? And then when the screen goes blank the last time, and are you willing to tell me that? Because we were calling it implicit bias, but I didn't know if it was implicit or not. Maybe it was quite explicit. Maybe the teachers felt that they had a good reason to be watching one child versus another child, even though these were just child actors that were placed on a table. So rather than me telling you what the findings were, I thought it would be maybe more interesting for you to hear Corey Turner of NPR News telling you in 2 minutes flat the findings from this study, as well as the findings from the second study that we did at the exact same time.
There's a new study out of the Yale Child Study Center that I had to read a few times just to believe what it was telling me. The researchers recruited about 135 preschool teachers. They had them watch video footage of 4 kids playing: a black boy, a black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And they told the teachers, their subjects, watch the video, there may be some challenging behaviors. As soon as you see something that could become challenging, hit the enter key on your keypad. Well, here's the trick. There was no challenging behavior. The researchers were using eye scan technology to see which child the teachers were looking at the most. And what they found is that the teachers, both white and black alike, spent the most time watching the black boy, waiting for bad behavior that never came. There's one more really interesting headline in this study, which comes later. The teachers were also given a 1-paragraph description to read of a hypothetical child with a stereotypical name who behaves pretty badly in class, pushes, scratches, throws toys. And some of the teachers were also given some biographical information that helped make sense of that behavior. They were told that the child lives with his mother, father has been in and out for years, they're relatively poor, the mother is depressed, works 3 jobs. The researchers wanted to know if knowing this information made the teachers more empathetic to the kid. Well, here's the shock. It did, but only if the teacher and the child were of the same race. If the teacher and the child, a white teacher and a black child, or even a black teacher and a white child, knowing that biographical information, those teachers were less empathetic towards those students. And here's why this matters. Imagine if this is true, if there's this empathy deficit in preschool, well, imagine where else that's true.
Yes, a good question, doesn't he? I mean, like, who has more love in their heart than an early care and education provider? And it's not that they're bad people. They're wonderful, amazing, incredible people who've given their life to taking care of other people's children and not being paid very much for it. It's just that they're also wonderful, amazing, terrific, complicated humans. And we all have biases inside of us. Probably my favorite finding of the study is the one that gets absolutely no press. And that's that when we did the study, it was a deception model, obviously. We couldn't tell the teachers we're studying bias, because then, how do you study bias by telling people you're studying bias? You have to, do something like this in order to be able to get out of them what their behaviors would be if they actually believed that a child might be misbehaving. So ethically speaking, when you do something like that, then you need to go back to them and say, we didn't tell you the whole truth. We told you true things, but we didn't tell you all the truth. And the rest of the truth is this, that it's not really a study of just, can you find behavior problems, because there aren't any to find. It's really a study of bias, and in particular, yours. And as a result, I need to give you the ability to be able to withdraw your data. Like if you don't want us to use the data, now that you know the full reason for the study, you have the right to withdraw the data. And when we went back to 130 some of them and told them this, only one teacher asked to have their data removed. In my mind, that's the very best finding of all of it. Because what it tells me is this: we have a workforce that perhaps loves its babies more than its bias. That it's willing to explore these things, that we actually can talk about these things. I'll be honest with you, I was scared to death that basically we would have invested that much time and energy into a study that might not actually be able to work because many people would just remove their data. We wouldn't have enough sample left. And then when only one of them decided to remove their data, that was not only a relief, but an important message about our workforce and about the potential that we have to be able to explore these things with a workforce that loves its babies more than it wants to protect its biases. It reminds me of this story. I was giving a talk on a topic similar to this in Las Vegas, Nevada, back in February 1st of 2021. And I was talking about implicit bias in the early years. And then a family court judge came up and talked about biases that happen in family court decisions, in child welfare decisions, termination of parental rights, parent removal things. And he talked for a while. And then we all sat down and it was time for like the lunch. And I got the lemon chicken because at a conference it's always lemon chicken and salmon, right? So I went with the lemon chicken and I sat back down at my table, and then the MC there on the right came up and she brought with her a young girl who was in the audience. And she said, "I was surprised to see you here. I didn't know that anybody who was a younger person would come to something like this, you know." And she said that she came there with her mother. And I was surprised too. When I looked out, I didn't see anybody who looked younger. And then the MC said, "Well, what do you remember that was talked about here today? What did we talk about that you remember?" And she said, "Well, I remember when that professor guy was talking about how teachers look at kids like me." And then I'll admit, I became incredibly worried. I became very worried that I might have said something that might have hurt her. That maybe she had heard something in this that she'll internalize and it'll change the way she views schools and teachers and things. And it became very concerning to me. And then the MC asked the next question, which was the question I wanted to know the answer to, but would have been afraid to ask. And she said, "Well, how did that make you feel?" And then this little girl said something that I will never, ever, ever forget. She said, "Well, me and my friends, we already knew it. We just didn't think you all did." That's what she said. And, like my way into this topic was that I do research on early care and education and early childhood development and things like this. My background is not studying biases. I went into that topic because it is the elephant in the room that cannot be ignored, and that I need to understand that better. If I can't understand that better, I'll understand nothing at all. You know what I mean? It's always in it. And so I needed to seek out mentors who could help me understand this. People like Howard Stevenson and others, who just incredible thinkers on the top. Iroma Ruka in our early childhood field. And they've been incredibly, incredibly helpful to me. But I have to say, in all due respect to all of them, I don't think I'd ever learned as much as I did that moment with that little girl when she said that we already knew it. What she said was a lot of things. One is she said, all of these things that happen, you may think you're hiding it from somebody, and you may think you're even hiding it from yourself, but the children, they see it. They see it. Biases are contagious, kind of like COVID. You're the most contagious and the most likely for somebody else to get sick when you don't even think you got it. That's contagious. When you're asymptomatic, or you feel you're asymptomatic, that's when you're going to be the most contagious. And she taught me a few other things too. One of the other things that she taught me was that I probably shouldn't be so worried, because I'm not going to tell her something she didn't already know. I'm not going to hurt her. I might hurt me worrying about it. She already knew it. She knew it before I knew it. She knows it deeper than I can possibly know it. I can study it, I can think about it, she can feel it. You know what I mean? Like, that's what I learned from her. And if we're really wanting to study this topic deeper, we should be studying it from the perspective of the adults and the perspective of the children too. and the bystanders as well. Because every time there's bias like that happens in a classroom where a child gets expelled, there's a whole bunch of other children who just saw that happen. And that taught them something. And some of the times the lessons that stick the most are the lessons we never intended to teach. Those are the lessons that get absorbed. And they get absorbed like little teeny tiny cuts over and over again in the course of every single day. That's what I learned from that little girl on February 1st, 2018 in Las Vegas. So when I think about the topic of early care and education, I'm reminded that the top studies that we talk about in this field are things like the Preschool Study and the Abecedarian Study and the Chicago Child Parent Center Study. These are all studies that have cost-benefit analyses attached to it that allow us to be able to talk about how much, return on investment we get in early care and education. And at the same time, we also know the Preschool Study, the most widely cited study to make the case for early care and education in America, is a study where every single one of the children in the study were Black, every single child. And the Abecedarian Study in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, 98% Black. And the Chicago Child Parent Centers, 93% of the children in that study were Black. We've taken data that belong to our Black children, families, and communities and used it to create a program for the benefit of all children. And then when no one's paying attention, we disproportionately kick out the very children whose data purchased the program in the first place. That's what's basically happening here. And when you think about opportunity and civil rights and social justice, that's oftentimes about issues of access. That could mean access to a seat on a bus, or it can mean access to a seat at a deli counter, or access to voting, access to higher education, or it can mean access to elementary school. And in this case, we're talking about access to the earliest forms of education in the form of our child care programs and our early care and education programs. But access isn't just about getting in the front door. It's also about making sure you're not shoved out the back door too. That's what access is about. And it's also about all the quality, the experiences that you're able to participate in the time between the front door and the next door that you leave through. All of those things are about access. It's not just about getting in the program. It's about what you're experiencing in that program and whether or not you get to stay in that program. And so those are the reasons that I care about this topic. I'm also heartened by the fact that we have things that we know can help. Things like early childhood mental health consultation. We've done 2 statewide random controlled trials, one in Connecticut and one in Ohio. Statewide random controlled trials showing that if you make mental health consultants effective and available in an early care and education program, that you can significantly change the teacher's perceptions of that child's behavior problems because you're providing that teacher with the support that they deserved all along. I don't know if it necessarily means that we're always changing the child's behaviors, but I do know this: we're changing the teacher's perspective on that behavior. And it's not the behavior that gets you expelled, it's the perspective on it that gets you expelled. If I can change the teacher's own feeling of whether or not they have the competency to be able to manage that, that's all it takes. And if you can change the child's behavior too, that's wonderful. But if I can just create more competencies within a teacher or a capacity within them to not feel overwhelmed by it, just by providing them supports, that in and of itself is a huge benefit. And what we had found in both Connecticut and Ohio is significant improvements with a very little amount of time. These are mental health consultants that were already available in the communities. They were just being deployed into early care and education programs. Instead of expelling children out of child care program after program after program, and then eventually that child ends up in a child mental health clinic, what about expelling the mental health clinicians out of their clinics and putting them in child care programs where they can actually be a source of prevention for somebody? That's ultimately what the model is, and we found that it was highly successful. We also found, however, that access to early childhood mental health consultation is kind of spotty. More access in Head Start and Early Head Start because it's part of the performance regulations. More access in the schools because at least there's social workers there. Far less access, especially regular access where somebody's regularly available when you're talking about child care centers. But if you're an eagle eye, you'll notice that I put that scale on a scale from 0 to 50%. What if I put that scale on a scale of 0 to, let me back up. We also found this, that over the course of the pandemic, we significantly increased the amount of access to mental health consultation for children of color. But if I put that on a scale of 0 to 100%, you can see that even though we can pat ourselves on the back for that, in the end, almost no programs have access to mental health consultation. The amount of access is incredibly low. We can do better. We can do better for our children and our families, and in many cases, that means doing better for those amazing, wonderful people who take care of them every single day by providing them not only better pay, but also the supports they need in order to be able to do the job that they're wanting to do for our children and families. So here's some of our funders, some of the Yale team that's been working on some of these things. Thanks to the 126,894 amazing people who give their lives to young children every single day and participated in these studies. And you can see a quick quote there from Ed Ziegler reminding us that it is these children and their families who are our partners in all of these studies. It is their data. I am just a steward who've been entrusted with their data by them, and I need to take that responsibility very seriously, as do all of us. So thank you so much for all of that. I think I probably talked a little bit longer than you anticipated.
That's okay. I think we still want to take just a couple of questions if we have them. Maybe somebody can just ask them rather than try to do the cards. Is there anybody in the audience that has a question that they want to ask right now? Jordan, hi, Jordan.
So I was wondering thank you. Hi, Jordan Hines from the National Governors Association. Thanks so much for that great presentation. It was my first time seeing it, and I already can't wait to share that kind of information with our members. So I think it's going to be really impactful. One question that I had, we talked about the correlation between provider stress levels, whether that's wherever that may be from, and the amount of expulsions or suspensions that they end up doling out. So have there been any kinds of research that shows specifically between like compensation and wage as a part of economic stress and its impact on expulsions and suspensions?
Yes. And what would you expect that the finding was, if you were to make a wild guess?
As wages went up.
So nobody's looked specifically at when wages go up, what happens to expulsions, but they have looked at this. When wages go up, stress levels go down and depression rates go down. And we know from a lot of other study that higher depression rates and stress rates lead to increased expulsion rates. So there's no reason to believe that if A plus B equals this and B plus C equals this, that if we put them together, that we wouldn't be able to reduce expulsion, in part by being able to improve the mental health functioning of the providers. But there's another element to the question that you're asking, which is sort of like the pathway of effect. And mental health consultation has at least a couple of different pathways of effect. One of them is that perhaps the mental health consultant is indeed able to impart to this early care and education provider a new set of skills that's going to help improve the behaviors and the functioning of the children in the classroom. But it's also possible that the mental health consultant, just by being there and as a support, is able to reduce the stress levels in the teacher, which will also reduce the expulsion rates. And so you have basically at your disposal now two pathways to get you to the outcome of fewer children being kicked out of programs.
Walter, I want to follow up on that because one of the things that I was curious, it struck me when you were talking about the stress level during COVID versus otherwise. It seems to me like the stress level is constant in childcare. It may have gone up in COVID, during COVID, but it's the stressors that are there all the time. Low pay, hard work, poor working conditions, et cetera. So could you see any difference between those two things? I mean,
yeah, we looked at that about as well as we possibly could using other studies that have been done. And what I can say is this: before the pandemic, based on other people's studies, so there's a few other people like Bob Whitaker and a few other people who've been looking at teacher mental health functioning in early care and education programs before the pandemic. And teachers, especially in programs like Head Start and many child care programs, do report higher rates of depression and stress than the general population, and higher rates of depression and stress than the general female population, which is an important way to look at it given the fact that the workforce itself is about 96% women. And so before the pandemic itself, mental health concerns were great within this profession. But then after the course of the pandemic, not only did depression rates and stress rates go up for childcare providers and early educators, but they went up at a sharper increase than the general population and the general female population. And so if you then later into the pandemic looked at depression rates of women in general and compared that to the workforce of early care and education providers, it's more than twice as high. In other words, it wasn't just that they tracked higher during the course of the pandemic. There seemed to be something about working in the field that not only was incredibly stressful to them, but then the course of the pandemic had an even deeper impact on them than it did on people in general. So all of that taken together really makes me just honestly incredibly worried for our field, incredibly worried for these people who have decided to dedicate their lives to taking care of other people's children. I think they have been suffering an awful lot. And when you talk to them, I don't know how many of you know an early educator, have an early educator in your life, and you talk to them about how they're feeling, what do? They immediately tell you about the children. My worry is that, this is a field that would take a bullet for these babies. And my worry is they do. That's my worry right there in a nutshell.
Any other questions over here?
Thank you. I am Chandrea Brown from Jumpstart for Young Children. And nice to meet you finally in person. You're not unique. And I have a question. So when it comes to racial bias in educators, how does that affect children? I know when it comes to early childhood, it's one of the most segregated institutions across the board in education. So regardless of that, how does that racial bias in educators affect children, even if they are part of the same race amongst them?
Wow, that's a great set of questions. So, yeah, when you think about like I'm a fan of Head Start. I love Head Start. And I worked with Ed Ziegler very closely for 20, 25 years. Many people refer to him as the father of Head Start. I'm a Head Start proponent. And at the same time, I have to acknowledge the fact that Head Start is by design a socioeconomically segregated program by design. And in many communities, socioeconomic segregation is de facto racial segregation. It's inherent within the way in which it was set up. And so those things sort of exist within our field. I don't think anybody was setting out to create a racially segregated program, but the net result is that in many communities, Head Start becomes that. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? This many years after Brown versus the Board of Education, should we literally be creating segregated programs by design? Those are important questions, I think. And I think it's okay, and I think it's possible to love and admire Head Start and still yet wrestle with the things to make it better. One of the things that I think about within the question that you raise is that. Another thing that I think about is some of the work of Andy Meltzoff at Washington University, who's done some incredible studies looking at how contagious bias is. And he did this study where he had preschool age children, looking at videos of how different adults were treating different children and how quickly those children, preschool children, were able to immediately internalize the bias that they saw, and then they pick it up themselves. And so whenever I think about this topic of bias, it's not just about the effect that has on the person who has it and on the child or the family who might be experiencing it, but also on every single bystander that's around that child. That becomes a socially modeled lesson for them too. And when I think about it very expansively, there's a few other things that it raises as concerns for me too. We're concerned in this field that we want to make sure that our field looks like the children that we serve and the families that we serve. And that's important. We need a field that's as diversified as the children and the families that we serve. But we shouldn't believe that just by diversifying the people who are in the field, that somehow is going to take us to the promised land. It's not. You know, there's other things that we have to be concerned about too. Like we did a study a few years ago looking at lead teachers and assistant teachers and found how different their jobs are in classrooms sometimes. You know, and oftentimes when you look at classrooms that might have several adults and there might be some diversity of race and ethnicity in there, you'll notice that the lead teacher looks like this and the assistant teachers look like that. And if the assistant teachers and the lead teachers are really truly co-teaching, such that the child is experiencing all of them together, or has a special relationship with each one of them, or a special relationship that's maybe more with just one than the other, that's very different than if the child is in a classroom where the lead teacher, who looks like this, is the one responsible for all the curriculum and the child interactions, and the assistant teachers are all the table wipers. And if we don't do this really well, if we're not thoughtful about this, if we're not smart about this, then some of the times it could be easy that the net result is that all we do is expose children at an even younger age to racially defined social hierarchies, if we're not thoughtful about this. And that in the end, going right back to some of the other things that we talked about before, it's about how the adults are treated and how the adults treat each other in front of those children. I was at a presentation I was asked to be a discussant. Different people were talking about male involvement in early care and education and the importance of men. You know, and of course the first speakers talked about how, you know, it's important to have men in early care and education programs because many children need to have a male role model, you know. And then the next person had a paper that was kind of similar to that, kind of the same message, but in a little different way than a third person. And so I'm trying to think as I'm discussing, you know, like, what am I going to add that's different to this? You know, and the first thing that I thought of at that time, and I've been thinking about this ever since, is, you know, I made the point that, you know what, yeah, it's important that young children have access to a present male role model. But many of our children, even if there's no father in the family, they do have access to male role models, you know, in terms of friends of the family and grandfathers and uncles and older brothers and cousins and all kinds of things like that. At the same time, maybe the bigger impact is this. In early care and education programs, there's typically more than one adult. There's usually a teacher or a couple of teachers and assistant teachers, you know. And if one of the adults in the classroom is a man, I can pretty much guarantee you this, given the demographics of the workforce, the other adults in the classroom are women. It's not going to be a class with 3 men. You know, we don't have that many men. And so perhaps the biggest impact is this. It's an opportunity for children to see a man and a woman working together in mutual respect and in an egalitarian way. And even if they have a male role model in their life at home, they might not ever get a chance to see that. To see a man and a woman working together. And what about to see adults who look different from each other working together in mutual respect? To see that every single day when I go in and I can see these two people who look very different, but they seem to really like each other and they get along. You know, what is the lesson inside of that? I worry some of the times that we just don't pay enough attention to the fact that the curriculum isn't in a book. It's in the people. It's in the people and it's in the relationships.
We have another question right here.
Hello, friend.
Hey.
So, Lee Johnson III with the National Black Child Development Institute. You were talking, you showed the studies from both Connecticut and Ohio. And we know that early childhood mental health consultation at its core is very thoughtful and intentional. I was curious about how you perhaps speaking to some of the results around the success of early childhood mental health consultation. I know that you're talking about it, how it helps aid in tamping down, expulsion and suspensions. But just wanted to hear from you just some of your findings around some of the success to that contribution in the classroom.
Great question. So mental health consultation, we found significant reduction in teachers' perceptions of the severity of behavior problems in usually just a few weeks, fairly significant. We found in some other studies decreased stress rates reported by the early care and education providers. We've seen some indication in some studies of increased involvement with the families, because a good mental health consultant comes in and works with the teaching staff, but then immediately goes to make sure they also work with the parents and the families. And in many cases, and I say this as somebody who's studied this, and I mentioned policy in it, but I also used to be a mental health consultant in early care and education classrooms. You don't usually get contacted as a mental health consultant when things are going well. You don't even usually get contacted when things are going poorly. You get contacted when things are about ready to fall completely apart. And by that point, there's oftentimes not a good relationship between the parents and the providers. And so if you're thoughtful about this work, the last thing you'd want to do is to come in and spend too much time with just the staff before you meet with the parent, because then you're going to be seen as being aligning yourself with somebody. So you want to come in, you answer the request coming from the staff, and then you immediately want to try and reach out and work with the parents. And then oftentimes when it's at its best, it's taking a relationship that you're able to build with the staff as a mental health consultant, and a relationship that you're helping to be able to build with the parents, the family, and then bridging those two together. And then having them be able to share their experiences, and then slowly pulling yourself out of that relationship so that you can leave behind a better relationship. And some of the studies that we've been able to do, and some of the studies that other people have been able to do, have suggested that indeed, when mental health consultation programs are offered, relationships between all of the adults in that program and at that home can improve as well. Thank you.
To add, hi, Jenny Patterson, also National Black Child Development Institute. I'm curious, you were talking about how your study found that teachers had less empathy for children outside of their race. Would a mental health consultant help create more empathy for children outside of their race? Did you find that?
Oh, that's where we want to go next. Yeah, that's where we want to go next. One of the other things, and I guess I could have said this when we were talking too, is like a mental health consultant, at its very least, is another set of eyes. It's another set of eyes to be able to see things from an objective perspective. And it's a set of eyes that can see more things because they're not having to take all the responsibility that an early care and education provider has to do to be able to make sure that all the children are being well cared for. And they don't have the stress that might be clouding things. And they don't have necessarily all of the other history. And so they're able to come in and be able to see things and notice things. I wonder, are we able to train our mental health consultants to be able to effectively talk about bias? When you see it in the classroom, how do you talk about it? My dear friend, Linda Smith, I know that if I were to walk up on a stage or come up here and I had tissue on my shoe, my friend Linda probably wouldn't announce it really loudly, but she would probably say, Walter, you got a little tissue on your shoe, and I said, oh, and then I'd take it off. Or my friend Lee might say, Walter, you got a little something stuck in your teeth there. He wouldn't say it to everybody. He'd just say it to me, and then I said, oh, thank you. And I'd be glad, and I'd get it out of my teeth and everything else like that. And then I'd feel a little bit better. How do we get a topic like bias to that point, to where we're comfortable pointing it out with somebody else, and then that other person is glad you did, because now I can try and address it a little bit before I get on stage. That's ultimately, I think, where we need to be able to get a topic like this, but we can't get it there if people are so hurt and upset by it, that they think that because you have a bias or because you let a bias show, that means that you're a terrible, horrible person to your core. You know what I mean? We have to get to a new point in this where it's okay to talk about this, where we care more about the children in our care than we want to protect our own image of ourselves. And if we can get to that point and be a little bit better talking about this, then my hope is ultimately that can become an important, what you're raising right there, component of an early childhood mental health consultant. Thank you for
One
that
more.
question.
Brittany.
Hi, Dr. Gilliam.
Hello, Walter.
Walter, I had a follow-up question to that. So in your study, when you were looking at bias and empathy, did you break out the respondents by age and see if there's a generational gap in whether or not they were able to feel empathy or respond more appropriately for children of different race or ethnicity?
Wow. Yeah, we broke out based on race and ethnicity of the teacher. We didn't have enough sample in the particular eye tracking to be able to do it on gender. I didn't do what we did it based on educational level and a few other things. We didn't do it based on generational gap, like you said. But now that you've asked the question, now we're going to. Because that's a fascinating way to look at it.
Yeah, especially in early childhood.
Yeah, you can look at age and you can also look at years in the field, which are going to be overlapped, but not completely. There might be some difference. Yeah, it's a great question.
Well, I think we've gone way over here, and I
sorry.
appreciate. No.
I got talkative.
Nope, we had good questions and good content. So I guess we need to wrap it up. But I want to thank everyone here who came and participated in this, and it was I think, an excellent conversation. Hopefully, it'll spur some people to think more about this as we move forward and we show some of the results of your research and your studies. So in closing it out, thank you.
Thank you.
Walter, so much for coming and participating in this. It was terrific. And well, to be continued, I hope that we have more of these kind of conversations for our field and that we can really, truly deal with some of the issues that we have around the workforce. I think at the end of the day, the points you made are so important to all of us. So with that, I want to thank everyone here for coming and also thank our funders who fund our work here at BPC. We really appreciate that. They are Hyacinth Simons, the Packard Foundation, Kellogg, and our Robert Wood Johnson. And thank all of them because it's very important work, I think. So thank you, and everybody have a great weekend.